Hi everyone, welcome to Camp Conversations Parenting Edition, Episode 2. I'm really excited to answer some more submitted questions today. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dayna Conway. I'm a clinical counselor with a master's in counseling psychology. For those of you in the US or abroad, this is a form of therapist, and my specific focus is families, parents, and children. And I also have an education background and was a former teacher. Camp Conversations is built on my passion project, which is camp, an approach and framework to address challenging behavior from a mental health perspective for calm and confident parenting. I'm so happy to have you here today. I'm so grateful to everyone that is submitting questions. If you want to submit a question too, follow along at Camp for Mental Health on Instagram or Facebook, and you can DM a question directly to me and I will do my best to answer it on this podcast. All right, let's jump into our 2 questions for this week. Our 2 questions are pretty related. One is, why does my kid lose it after daycare or after school? This question is specifically about daycare and their 4-year-old coming home and just having a complete meltdown most days, but we can also touch base on why this makes sense if you have an older child in elementary school. And our second question is, my child keeps making excuses for their behavior, and how do I get them to take responsibility for their behavior when they've done something wrong? I love these 2 questions because they tie together really nicely, and I'll make sure that you have some go-home tools and strategies that you can start using today if you want to. Okay, so let's get back to this first question. So why is my kid losing it after daycare? Thank you, Emily, for submitting this to me. So Emily has a 4-year-old child. They're coming home from daycare, and they're just having a total meltdown, not even wanting to do their favorite things. They seem inconsolable, lying on the ground, kicking legs, your classic preschool meltdown. Emily, if you are listening, you are not alone. I have experienced this as a parent myself, and I remember I approached it completely different as a clinical counselor in my practice before I had my own kids. Having your own kids is such a mirror in your face. There are all of these things that you think you know going into parenting, especially if, like me, you did a lot of education around supporting children before becoming a parent. And then when you go to put it in practice, holy moly, it is so different. And if, like me, you have multiple children, you realize that one strategy you pick up that works for one child won't necessarily work for the next. So I'm going to cover a couple of strategies here, but again, I love when you guys keep submitting these questions or commenting on this podcast, because then I know that either if the strategy I work fixed the situation or supported the situation, I will keep using it. And if you're like, hey, that's a strategy I've already tried, then wonderful, share that with me, and I'll make sure in our next podcast I share a couple more so that we can start getting some that fit for your family. Okay, so back to Emily's 4-year-old rolling on the ground after daycare. Why is this happening? Okay, I want you to think of this. This is how I explain this in my practice. We all have a cup for big emotions. And that cup only has so much space in it. As adults, we can really relate to this cup, because when I wake up in the morning as an adult, my cup of big emotions sometimes starts with a little bit of water, or let's be real, coffee in it. I'm going to talk about my coffee cup because that's my most important morning cup. So I wake up and there's a little bit of leftover coffee in that cup. And that leftover coffee has to do with past experiences or current thoughts or current issues that give me some big emotions, so that are contributing to big emotions in my life. And so those big emotions sometimes are there every day, especially if I've been through some big traumas or big changes. And so I wake up with some stuff in my cup, and then trying to rush my kids out the door and get them ready for school or daycare, and get myself ready for work and try and look somewhat presentable adds to my emotional cup usually. Usually there's a little bit of anxiousness, a little bit of worries. Often there's some frustration at trying to get everyone in. So I add some liquid to my cup. Then maybe I get everyone dropped off and I realize I forgot something. That might happen to me a lot. And so something important was forgotten on our way to school or daycare. And yeah, that adds to my emotional cup. Then finally we get everyone in their spaces and I get to work, and oh man, there's something that was in my planner that I completely ignored, and so it surprised me. That adds to my emotional cup. So as the day progresses, there are little things that will add and add and add to my emotional cup. And if I've had some practice at recognizing this, then I can do some activities throughout the day, like deep breathing, exhalations, going for a walk, that as an adult can slowly empty out some of my cup. Kids, I don't expect them, especially like Emily's 4-year-old, to have that awareness to be able to make a plan and empty some of their cups. So their cup's kind of collecting as the day goes on. Then, even as an adult with a fully developed prefrontal cortex, if I come home from work and I have been filling my cup all day, and instead of doing things to empty it, I've been doing things like drinking more coffee or adding a little bit more stress inducing activities into that, like throughout my day, then I'm going to come home with my cup at the brim. When I come home with my cup at the brim, one tiny little thing, and I'll give you my personal, most common example, someone leaving out their dishes or not unloading the dishwasher. Mine is usually around dishes. Tends to be that first thing I notice when I'm frustrated and I come out the door or come in the door. That one little thing, not only do I have some big emotion around that, if that was at the top of my cup when that thing happens, then instead of me reacting just to the dishes, my whole cup starts to spill over. And so the size of my reaction is pretty big. It's more than just a reaction that should be related to the dishes. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this in a long-winded way to let you know that one thing I really want you to avoid doing with children is the same thing I want you to avoid doing with other adults. If when I have that spillover, my husband or some helpful friend or even my child were to say to me, Mom, the size of your reaction doesn't match the size of the problem. Let's sit down for a minute and think about how big a problem the dishes not being done is compared to how big a reaction you're having. I really dislike this strategy because it is completely ignoring the fact that my reaction had to do with everything in my cup. And I, again, am a, air quotes, developed adult. And I have days where my cup does spill over. And trying to match it to the size of my problem would only cause me to spill over again. It would start adding to that cup again. And so I do not do this with children. I do not try and match the size of their reaction to the size of the problem, because I want to acknowledge that we all have a cup and I want to understand what's going on in that cup so that I can teach them strategies to let some out of that cup. So my first thing is, do not do that activity. Do not match the size of the problem to the size of the reaction. What could we do instead? I want you to also skip the open-ended questions. I know right now I'm giving you a lot of things not to do. Don't worry, I'm going to give you things to do. Because our other approach that we tend to use is we ask open-ended questions. What's going on with you? oh, holy moly, you're having a big reaction. Tell me about your day. What is this? What is happening? When we do that, even when, let's go back to my clinical setting, if an adult were to sit across from me and they're coming into my clinical space and they look like they're pretty dysregulated, like there's a lot going on in their brains, if I ask them an open-ended question like, help me understand what brings you here, or how are you doing today? They usually do one of two things. They either shut down because they have such a full emotional cup that they're like, I can't even begin to tell you what's in this cup because there's so much, and that in itself will probably cause it to spill over, and I really just don't want to spill over right now. So that instead they just keep the lid on the cup, and they're like, when I booked this session, I was having a rough time, but now things are going better. And they kind of shut down the conversation. The same thing goes with our loved ones, right? Same thing goes for myself personally. If I can feel that my cup is about to spill over, if someone asks me an open-ended question, I usually shut it down because I want to be in a safe space before I let that spillover happen. Second, and so with our kids, when they come home from school and we can see that they're a bit dysregulated, I want to be aware of how I start phrasing questions. So if I can see like my 4-year-old has come in the door, they're maybe tossing things down or they're looking upset, or I can see we're on that breaking point of where stuff's going to hit the fan. And I know you guys know that with your own children. I'm going to really catch myself and stop myself from asking that big, open-ended question. Then, I love doing these podcasts. This is really hard when I've been trained to talk back and forth with people and then keep asking me questions for me to stay on track, because I want to answer every question I think that you're going to ask me as you're listening. So bear with me as I'm learning how to do this. Okay, now, we've highlighted what not to do. So your child comes home dysregulated. They haven't quite started the tantrum, but you're just noticing the cues of dysregulation. So the first thing that we said, make sure we don't do is try and start matching the size of their dysregulation to the size of what you perceive as the problem. So, you're coming home from school upset again because I didn't bring you a snack for the drive home. That doesn't justify how upset you're acting right now, right? Like, we're not trying to match the size of the problem to the size of what we perceive as the reaction. And then the second thing we're trying to avoid is those open-ended questions. You're dysregulated. Again, tell me what's going on today. What's happening now? Because they're either going to shut it down or they're going to start to share every narrative that can justify how upset they are. We do this as adults too. I'm sure you can reflect and think of a time you've done this, or you can think of a time a loved one has done this, where someone says, what's going on? And we start to share everything in the cup. And we usually, especially if this is a really close loved one, like a spouse, start to share some of the things they're doing to add to the cup. And the reason we do that is because if I can dysregulate you for a second and see you dysregulated, then for that split second, instead of me having to tap into my emotional intelligence and label what emotion is going on and really reflectively think about it, I can make you feel that emotion, and I'm like, you understand now. And then if you, the other adult, stay dysregulated, then it flips from me going, ooh, you understand now, to, okay, now this is scary. You were supposed to be the calm, sturdy one. Now you're dysregulated, and now we're both dysregulated, and now this whole situation is overwhelming. Your kids do this really well. So when they've had a really tough day and they've had to keep the lid on the cup all day, Sometimes that unloading, that spillover of the cup is because now I'm in a safe space and I want the people around me to get just how hard this day was. And if you have one of those kids that all of a sudden starts bringing narratives that seem completely unrelated to the situation, like, oh, this makes me think of the time when you forgot to pick me up, or you didn't bring my shoes or my swimsuit, and you're like, that has nothing to do with your meltdown right now. What they're doing is that same thing we sometimes do with our spouses or like extremely close loved ones, is they are trying to dysregulate you for a minute, because if they can dysregulate you, they know for that split second, when they see that, now you feel what I feel, so you get me. But then if you stay dysregulated, it goes from that, you get me, to, oh, now this is really scary. There really is reason to be this upset because my mom is that upset now. So that's just kind of what's going on behind the scenes there with those big dysregulation moments. So now I've told you what's going on behind the scene. I've given you things not to do. So what can you do? What can you do in these moments? If it is like we're on the tip of the iceberg, so the meltdown hasn't totally started yet, in those moments, I try and guess why it makes sense that they're coming in to my space the way that they're coming in. They're coming home from school or daycare the way that, in their kind of dysregulated way. So as they walk in the door, I'd say something that I see, like, oh, seems like you had a pretty tough day. And then I move to why that makes sense. Seems like you've had a pretty tough day. And you know what? That makes sense because it's Thursday. You've had to do 4 days of daycare. That means 4 early mornings. That means 4 days of kind of rushing around. That means 4 days of having to follow rules that we don't necessarily have at home. And I start guessing what's going on for them. Sometimes this will push kids over the edge. That this will be that last kind of straw to move to the spillover. And that's okay, because I'm not actually trying to avoid the spillover. The spillover is a really awesome teaching moment for me. When the spillover happens, so maybe this intervention of me guessing, maybe that stops the spillover. It will eventually, with time, stop the spillover, because it's teaching my children to recognize what is in their cup. And then once they get to that place, then I can start teaching strategies of how to empty the cup. I can't teach those strategies to empty the cup until they realize what's in their cup. They have to build that reflective piece first. So I'm highlighting what I could guess that's in their cup. When my child starts correcting me, Mom, that's not why I'm upset. I'm upset because Johnny said he'd play with me and then he didn't play with me. Awesome. Now we've got to this point where you are reflective enough, you can correct me. That's amazing. That's a big step. I want to get to that point. So I'm not trying to guess it perfectly. I'm trying to guess it in a way that my child's going to eventually correct me. I know what you're thinking. Some of you are listening with toddlers and you're like, my toddler is not going to do that. That's okay, because it is amazing you're listening with toddlers, because if you start doing this at toddler age, your child isn't going to be the one coming home from school with this big dysregulation. Your child's going to be able to come home from school and say, this is what is in my cup today. And the night before, you're going to be like, this is what's in my cup going into tomorrow. And by the time your child is school age, you guys will already have strategies to empty out the cup. So even if you have a toddler, why does it make sense they feel that way? So that's our keyword. Why does it make sense? And we're saying that out loud. Once the spillover starts, as long as we're in a safe space, so at home, so like Emily says that this is happening at home most of the time, then I'm going to let the spillover happen. I know, it sounds so uncomfortable, right? Letting the spillover happen. That's how we're going to learn how to work through it. When we start thinking the spillover is wrong, our little brains start going into, I don't want to have this tantrum keeps happening, and that rumination, those thoughts cycling actually trap us in the tantrum. So I let the spillover happen. And then at my house, usually I take this as a cue as time to start playing some calm music. I try and reduce any stimulus, so I try not to talk a lot to add to the stimulus of the spillover. And I just remain a calm presence in the space to fire up their little mirror neurons so that they can steal some of my calm. Some of the families that I work with always say this: I'm going to share some of my calm with you. And I really like that. If I said that to my child, they would hate it. So understand your child, but you're going to start sharing your calm, whether you say that out loud or you're just doing that naturally. So we're sharing our calm, we're adapting the environment to bring calm. When the spillover is done and we do what we need to do, we create some space between the spillover. So right after the spillover, I don't talk about the spillover. I'll just be like, right after I lose it in front of my spouse, if my spouse said, okay, now let's talk about it, what would happen? I'd probably spill over again. So right after the spillover, I let things be. We move on to our next activity. Later in the evening, when we've started connecting again, I talk about why the spillover makes sense. So the same thing I did before, I'm doing again after. You know what? It makes sense that you're having a really tough time after school because, and I lay out all of the things that make sense to me. If my child doesn't like me touching on them directly, it makes sense you have a spillover after school, then I talk about myself. You know what? After work, I have a really tough time not just emptying my cup gradually, because my cup gets pretty full after work, and sometimes it just wants to spill over. Some of the stuff in my cup include rushing from one activity to the next. That adds some big emotions in my cup. Having my boss tell me what I have to do and when. Sometimes that adds some big emotions into my cup. And I talk about things in my cup. So our main strategy I want you to remember is, one, creating this cup with your kids, using this cup analogy, even having a cup on your fridge and talking about what's in our cup, learning how to reflect on what's in our cup of big emotions. And then two, either right before, if your child has some regulation time before their tantrum at the end, or sometime after, again, creating some distance, have a talk about why the behavior makes sense. So why does it make sense that it's really hard to hold it together after school? Those are our first two tools. And I'm going to stick with those two because this second question that I'm going to answer now relates to this first one, and I'm going to give you a couple more tools. So the second question that we have that I'm just reading here is, my child keeps making excuses for their behavior. How do I get them to take responsibility? This connects back to this first question because, as we talked about, excuses for behavior usually relate to this full cup. So this parent is talking about specifically when my kid is really upset. I'm just reading through your question, Stephanie. And yes, okay. So when their 6-year-old is really upset, they tend to do things that are against the family values. Specifically, it looks like breaking things. And then when Stephanie is saying, even when she sees her child break something during a tantrum, that the child often lies about it after the fact. And Stephanie is saying, how do I get her to own up what she's done or make an apology? And so what we're seeing, Stephanie, is if she's having a tantrum and then this behavior is happening where things are getting broken, I would say this connects back to the full cup. So it sounds like your 6-year-old is coming home with an extremely full cup. And in that spillover, these actions like breaking things are happening. And because of this, they are then trying to justify their actions, because that's what Stephanie's saying, is like they're trying to justify what they do or completely avoiding it. If they're justifying their actions, they're trying to tell us either one, that it's happening so in the heat of the spillover that they don't even feel like it was their own fault. And again, as a regulated, air quotes, adult, when I'm having a spillover, I often do things that are outside of my norm. So it makes sense to me that this can still happen with kids. Or they're pulling irrelevant stories. I broke this because one time you broke my favorite music box when you were mad. And so again, it's that spillover where it's happening, it's uncomfortable, and if I can make the safe adult in my life feel the same way, then momentarily they get how bad I feel right now. And so they're trying to kind of we hear this phrase a lot, your kids are pushing your buttons. They're not pushing your buttons to manipulate you. They're pushing your buttons because I don't have the words to exactly explain what's going on for me. And if I push your button and I get it right, then for a moment you're going to feel how I feel, and I know you understand. Let's be honest, how many of us still do this with our spouses? And so instead of asking them why they did that, so usually what we all do, myself included, even though I was trained not to do this, I still caught myself doing this as a parent. And I say, why did you break that? Why did you push your brother? Why did you? Then we are adding to their desire to create a narrative, right? So I did it because, and again, that opens the door. I'm going to say something to push your button so you get where I'm coming from. Instead, we use the same intervention that we talked about earlier, why it makes sense. We talk about why it makes sense, not to give them permission to do it, but to help them regulate their brain for a minute, that shame response, and then we put the boundary or the value in place. So it makes sense to me that the bowl was broken when you were upset because you were so upset from your huge day. Your body took control. You were having a big tantrum. You knew the bowl was special to me, and you were so frustrated with me that it seemed like a way of helping me understand. Like if you broke my bowl and I got upset, then maybe I'd understand how upset you were. It makes sense. Right? I'm trying my best to understand the motivation, and then I can still talk about what the boundaries are. In our house, our value is protecting the property inside and outside of the home. Even when we're frustrated, we're going to work together to make sure that when your body feels that out of control, there's nothing that can be broken in your space. So as your parent, I'm thinking that means when I see this happening, I start moving valuables out of the way. Do you have any ideas of where we could create a safe space for you to let out your emotion, or and we're joining kind of in that collaborative process. And I know this right now feels kind of far-fetched for these two kiddos writing in, a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. This is part of my camp approach that I've been working on with families for years now, and it is amazing that if we can start highlighting why it makes sense that behaviors happen at the start, then our kids really young are able to collaboratively work on solutions for these types of behavior challenges. One of the ones that my own children came up with is to have, and again, this is not their words, down-regulating spaces that are available to them right after school. And so we make sure that either in the morning or if they forget, I make sure that at some point in the day, I lay out, we have always a painting station because that's a big down-regulated activity in our home, a audio storybook station because that's a big down-regulating activity in our home, that are available right at the end of the day that I don't have to direct them to, that they just see in their space so they can move to those. So my strategies here is if your child keeps making excuses for behavior, talk about why it makes sense. Why does the behavior make sense? Because right now your child's trying to justify it. And so instead of making that space for them to justify it or push your buttons, get ahead of it and talk about why it makes sense. For this after school challenge, the second proactive strategy I want you to put into place, in addition to talking about this cup of big emotions, why the behavior makes sense, is to create down-regulating spaces in your house that relate to your child. So maybe these are car stations, maybe they're audiobook stations, maybe in your house you're okay with screen stations, water stations, whatever this might be, have those available proactively. So they're just sitting in the space. Okay, I feel like I've given you a ton of tools because I can't hear your questions coming back to me right now. We're going to leave it at this. Again, if you want to ask me more questions, please follow along at Camp for Mental Health. Submit your questions. You can build off of the questions from this podcast or submit completely different questions, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. I'm going for 2 questions a week. If you're more interested in the camp approach, follow along on the socials. Check out our website, www.campmentalhealth.com, and we have courses available there, community groups for parents, and one-to-one coaching with me. And just to finish with our takeaways from this session, this little podcast, I want you to help your kids understand their cup of big emotions. So build a cup of big emotions, share them with me. If you make a beautiful picture, I would love to see that. Offer clear, confident guidance instead of open-ended questions. So we're talking about why the behavior makes sense. We are talking about sitting with the dysregulation for a bit and then closing long after the dysregulation with, again, why the dysregulation made sense, and then offering choices for the next time that happens. So we're proactively building. Hey, it makes sense. This has been happening every day after school. Here's some ideas I have. Hey, what if I notice you really love playing cars? What if we had a car station? Because that seems to calm you down. Do you have any other things that calm you down? So we're trying to proactively plan for things that make sense. And then the best thing of all of this is, one of the things I talk to kids the most about in my practice is them taking it personally or feeling shame when their parents have big emotional outbursts. Kids often internalize this as their fault. If we start teaching the spillover idea young, then your children, like my children now, call you out on spillover, and they can see that your spillover is completely separate from them. That's a beautiful gift to give your children. It can be really frustrating as a parent for your kid to call out your spillover. I'm going to warn you that as first-person experience. But I remind myself that's a beautiful gift that I gave my children, because now they can see that me being in a bad mood is not a reflection of them. It's not their job to lift me up, and they did not bring me down. And so we're modeling emotional regulation with our own spillover cup. We're talking about our own spillover cup and showing them what we do to empty some of that cup as well. So thank you so much for listening today. If you could like or share this would help me greatly. And if you have any feedback for me, I love getting feedback, constructive, positive, negative, because it just helps me grow and evolve, and that's part of my journey here. So again, this is from the Camp Approach. Follow us on socials at Camp for Mental Health or www.campmentalhealth.com, and I look forward to meeting and hearing from you there.